All right, Coalition Purple back on the air, back from our vacations and whatever else we were doing yet
Good to see you
again.
again.
It's summertime. It's just so hard to
Yeah.
keep the consistency going. But anyways, we're back on it. When we left our last show, we talked about, hey, let's start really kind of honing down on kind of key issues that we think would help move the country forward, and in particular, a third party forward. And I I know you're probably much like me. To come up with one, two, three of those is really hard to do. I can come up with maybe 30 or 40.
Yeah.
But so that's the tough part. But it'll be something we can kind of cover over the course of time here. Because I think one of the things we keep talking about on the third party is what ultimately do you stand for? You do kind of have to have sort of your short list anyways of key things that you think are going to be most important. So my thought is, hey, let's each kind of come up with a few of them and just kind of lift them, just list the topics, and then we'll kind of start diving down deep. So where are you at in your head about some of the priorities you would like to see happen within a third party or focus
Okay.
on?
So just looking at things from a sort of a priority standpoint, obviously any party that wants to be successful needs to address the issues that concern the public the most. And those issues include the economy, healthcare, immigration, crime, environment, abortion, government spending, housing, education, national security. I'm just looking at a list of things that I was looking at that people are concerned about. And so, somewhere along the line, any party is going to have to address those things. But just for the purposes of today, I kind of like picked a few things that concern me. And I think one of the things that would benefit a third party is to start bringing issues to light that maybe people aren't talking about enough. So just to pick a few of mine is just I'll just do two for right now. The first one is cure diabetes. I know that that's not something that people just talk about, but like I would if I were to be elected president, one of the first things that I would do would be to launch a national campaign to cure diabetes. So I looked up this one number. In 2020 alone, the cost of diabetes to the United States was $413 billion when you look at the cost of diabetes and the related symptoms. And also, I'm a physical therapist who was a wound care specialist, and I
Yeah,
actually was present at many people's amputations where they had feet amputated, legs amputated, toes amputated. I
yeah.
mean, diabetes is an absolute nightmare. And one of the big issues for people just in general is healthcare. As long as you are spending $413 billion every year on diabetes, you are never going to fix the healthcare issue. So I think that one thing that we could do as a nation is just really figure out a way to deal with diabetes. And even if you never found the cure, but if you found better ways to treat it, you got better help to people who had it. Or, even if you were better at prevention, weight loss, people understanding things more about how you get diabetes, how you can control diabetes so that you're not dealing with the related costs as much and the lost productivity as much, because that's part of that cost. So, I mean, again, that's a really weird thing that nobody's really talking about, but the benefits of doing something like that could be gigantic. So that
I,
would be
I
my first one.
gotcha. No, I love your approach on that, and we'll dive more deeply into that. But I think that's exactly something that a third party could really benefit by focusing on very tangible issues. So many of the issues are
Hmm.
either so large and just out of scope for most people to get their heads around, or they're just kind of wonky policy kinds of things that people don't really care, which probably a lot of mine are that.
Yeah.
but but I think they drive a lot of that. I really like that approach. So what else you got?
Number two is, again, kind of with my strange way of thinking about things, I guess, is um, reduction of bureaucracy. Really shrinking things down. And I have these conversations with people all the time, and we think about the influence of government in our lives, and one of the way to give people more freedom and give them back more choices in their lives is to you know shrink the government so it's not costing so much. But there's one specific issue in that I think is really important and is not well understood and not talked about enough, and that is government unions. So in California, the big players in the government union sector are the teachers union and the SEIU, which is the government employees unions.
Right.
So to start off this conversation, I would say I am a very big supporter of private unions. I think the First Amendment guarantees the right of assembly. So, and I think that unions are a right of assembly issue. I mean, if you're working in a place and the people who work there want to get together and help each other to collectively bargain for whatever, I mean, how can you say that people can't agree to, form a group or a body? The problem comes in when you're talking about the government. The government of the United States theoretically exists for the benefit of all the people in the United States, not for the benefit of a small group within the government. So if you have a government union that's bargaining for its benefit within the government, then essentially the two sides of that argument are the government and the union. So the entity that's supposed to be looking out for the benefit of the people is being forced to compromise on something for the benefit of a very small group of people. And I think the best example of that you can see is how the teachers' unions manipulated the school closings during the pandemic. So the teachers, not surprisingly, and I can't really blame them for this because the disease was not very well understood when it first happened, didn't really want to expose themselves to being back in the classrooms where a lot of people could be sick and they could be sick, and maybe teachers are elderly and are at a high risk. So the teachers wanted what was best for them because they're a union. And that is to keep the schools closed so that they don't have to deal with any of that. I mean, it's a very natural reaction to things. But was closing the schools in California for like 2 years good for the population of California as a whole? And if you look at
Right.
the sway that the teachers union holds over the political parties, that is another huge problem. Because if you really think about how it all works and how funding works and how government works and how things work, especially in the state of California, the union supports the Democratic candidate who promises to give the union more money. So they give that candidate a huge sum. The largest single donated to political campaigns in California are the SEIU and the teachers union.
Right.
So they give huge amounts of money, and they give it solely to Democrats because the Democrats are the ones that promise to give them more money, more benefit, and whatever. So where does this union get this money? Well, it gets the money from its members who aren't
Members.
necessarily Democrats. So they are able to take money from their members to give to only one party. But then to give the money back to the teachers union, the politicians raise the taxes on everyone. So every one of us pays taxes, which then goes to the union, which then goes to the Democrats. So essentially what we have in
The vicious
California
circle.
is one publicly funded party and no other parties. So how can you possibly expect to have any kind of fair system in California when it comes to elections or voting or freedom or anything else when one party is publicly funded and has essentially an infinite amount of money that it can simply take from the population to give to a union, which then gives it back to them? And this is only possible in government unions. It's not in private unions. Private unions don't have this scenario. And so one big issue that I have is we need to address the way that public unions function and whether or not we should even have public unions. Because again,
Right.
if the government exists for the benefit of the overall population, you can't have a subsection of that population within the government saying that we exist only for ourselves. And that's the situation I think that we have, and it's especially bad in California.
Yeah. I've never really thought about it. That's a really interesting point because I'm generally pro-union. I've never been a union member,
Mhm.
but I mean, I understood, but it really was from more the private industry
Right.
perspective. And
And
I
that's
mean, the same scenario sort of applies in regards to, the United Auto Workers, they force higher wages or whatever. So ultimately you pay more for your car, but that's optional, right? As I'm not
right.
paying it out of taxes. It's optional. It's like, well, that Chevy, I'm not going to buy it because it's out of my price range or whatever, right?
Right.
So you do have that option where I never really thought about on the public union side. It's like, well, no, you'll end up, it's a vicious cycle, right? It just keeps
Right.
kind of going around and around. Not, and again, probably not because that wasn't necessarily the original intention,
Right. No.
but uh, the original intention, but the kind of unforeseen uh, consequences of it is kind of this circular,
Right. It goes on and on.
funding mechanism.
And that's, but as I say, I think, and the important point is that that I just would drive this home because this happens so much. People say unions. Well, it's so important to understand that the
Yeah,
huge difference between private sector unions and public sector unions, and it's tax, and it really does come down to tax money. The private sector unions can't fund themselves; they're dependent on the company that they're part of. So, like you
right.
say, the United Auto Workers, if the United Auto Workers drive the cost of vehicles up too high, then all the companies go bankrupt and United Auto Workers is doomed. So they are motivated to help their
Find a balance.
constituents. But yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. They have to find a balance, but not government unions. The government unions can just look at this infinite pool of tax dollars that the irresponsible people that they put in office are willing to give them, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, one of the biggest drivers of debt for the state of California is public employee pensions. Well, why is
oh
public
yeah,
employee
that's
pensions so
huge.
high? It's because the public employee unions who fund the politicians demand that they put more money into their pensions. And since there's only so many tax dollars to go around, and you have to fund these pensions, it all becomes debt. And that
Yeah,
makes everything cost more, makes housing cost more, makes it's a terrible cycle that has to be broken. And if you can't
yeah,
break it and you can't address it, and you can't mentally come and understand there's the huge difference between private sector unions and public sector unions, I mean, it's a huge intractable problem right now.
yeah. No, that's great. Definitely need to talk more about that one. I'm going to build off that though with one of mine. And my number one has always been campaign finance reform
Oh, I'm
across the
so glad
board.
you said. I'm so glad you said that.
because because what you just talked about in terms of the whole public union sort of thing kind of plays into that whole thing, that
Hmm.
we have to come up with sensible campaign finance reform across the board. And I don't know what the right number is,
Hmm.
but for fun, let's say maximum's $5,000 that any one individual or any one organization can give to any individual campaign. And whatever that number is, and I haven't really thought about that exact number, but somehow we have to put caps on this because,
Yeah.
and I'm reminded of this every day. Right now it's, during all the craziness going on with the presidential campaign, it comes to the forefront again, and Kamala Harris raised, what was it,
Yeah. Huge amounts of money. Yeah.
$320 million in the matter of less than a week. And then Musk, on the other side, Musk says, well, I'm going to give $45 million a month
Yeah. I know it's
to,
crazy.
to Trump's campaign. So it's like, we have this escalating financial war going on,
Yeah.
which is doing nobody any good. And they're beholden to basically their funders, right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to what you're saying about the public unions. That's another version of that. That hey, it's like, well, maybe that's a starting point for some of these things. That's hey, if you're part of a public union, if they continue to exist, there are limits by with which you can fund any particular campaign or initiative or whatever,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, all these problems that we ultimately, including like the diabetes thing, which I think is brilliant, um, it's all fun. It all comes down to money. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
what's going to get rewarded is, so we want to incent for solving problems, not
yeah.
incent for just because we like what you've been doing and it helps us as a small group, not the bigger party of folks out there.
So there's just two things that I come to mind, and this is why I'm so glad you said it. So there's the I'm trying to remember. I hope I get the name right. I think it was the Citizens United decision that
Yeah,
created that said, in the sort of language of the day, that it made corporations like
a
individuals
person.
that could a person that could donate things. So what it did was, if you really look at it technically, and I'm trying to remember exactly how it all worked, it created the corporations to give all this money, create a tax uh, shelter or something, and
Right.
it's called like a 501(c)(4). And
Yep.
I don't know if it's, but the reason it's called 501(c)(4) is because there was already a 501(c)(1), C2, and C3. And if I remember correctly, unions were already a 501(c)(3). And so part of the reasoning behind the Citizens United decision was, well, if a union can already give as much money as it wants to somebody, why can't a corporation?
Yeah.
And that's what I say. And that was sort of the reasoning of the decision. So it's like, well, I mean, if the union can give all the money, we're just gonna have to say that the corporation can too. But I think your idea is much better. Let's just get rid of all of it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I kind of like and I always sort of thought maybe that the best way to handle things would be on the spending side. Like you put a cap on how much can be spent in an election. Because if
Yeah,
you
you can do
cap
it
the
either
amount,
way.
yeah, if you cap the amount of spending, then all these donations would be
It
irrelevant.
naturally solves itself. The only
Yeah,
problem with the spending part of it is whatever the cap is for individual, it gets a little complicated with
yeah,
the
very complicated.
types of races, if they're running for a senator versus a president versus whatever. Um, and then, and say, and again, just making it up, presidential race, you can only spend whatever, $100 million.
Right.
Well, a Musk an Elon Musk can put $100 million in and he can literally control that one candidate, right? Just because
Yeah.
it's like, hey, we don't have to go do any more fundraising. We're done.
But the thing is,
So,
if you had that $100 million cap, you could also probably raise that amount of money from individual donations.
oh
And
yeah, for
and
sure.
that being said, then you don't need to be beholden to one person. You can just say, go screw off. I'm going to just take the private donations, and I have
And
as much money as anybody.
you would hope candidates would do that. But
Yeah.
then,
But who knows?
we're all, we all go where, the shortest distance between 2 points. It's just human nature.
Yeah.
But regardless, the whole campaign finance reform piece of it, I think kind of underlies everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Until you solve that problem, there aren't going to be any incentives to really look at the big picture and do
Yeah.
what's right for the most amount of people.
Well, I think another sort of big picture idea that encompasses, some of what we're both saying about campaign finance reform, about union reform, is that, you know, for a third party to work, we have to have fair elections. And
Right?
so we have to get to a point where, we can address some of the problems that we have in our electoral system. Otherwise you're probably not going to get anywhere with anything. So
No,
these kind of
exactly.
reforms they're just incredibly crucial, and bringing them to the forefront and getting people to focus on them more, I mean, that's a huge, huge thing.
Yeah. And I know it's not, campaign finance reform isn't the big sexy thing that people get all hot and bothered about because they don't really think about it, right? It's
Yeah,
just
but it
like this is the way
matters.
the game's played and all that. But it's one of those, underlying chronic issues that drives everything. And the second thing that was on my list was eliminating gerrymandering
Hmm.
because
Yeah,
it's the same sort of idea. The existing incumbents have every incentive to gerrymander their districts all these crazy things, right? And again, we're in this position where it changes, the relative representation. And again, both sides do it.
yeah.
Democrats and Republicans do it. I mean, you look at like what some of the crazy districts that go on in California.
Oh, it's nuts.
It's crazy, but it happens everywhere. It happens in Texas, any red state, blue state, they all do it. And it doesn't get the fair representation out there. And that's why I keep going back to it's like we have technology that can solve this problem. I mean, if it's
Yeah,
more
we can draw a
geographic,
grid.
we can draw grids that are totally objective, that are just based on the distances of things and eliminate it. And hey, as a politician, depending on where you are, you're having to represent people that are from an urban area as well as a suburban area as well as a rural area, which you could literally do here in
Yeah.
San Diego County very easily. You could draw. That's a good thing because you're having to represent, what really makes up this county. And so that one, gerrymandering and campaign finance reform to me are kind of like hooked at the hip. The other reason why they seem important to me is they don't require a constitutional amendment.
Right.
This could be
Yeah.
done. There's a lot of other things I'd like to see, like term limits and other things like that, but those would all require a constitutional amendment that would be very difficult.
Yeah. Very difficult. Yeah.
So, and much like the reduction in bureaucracy and the diabetes cure stuff, that could all be done. It doesn't require
Right. Nothing
constitutional
special.
amendment. These are just policy decisions that can be made, which I think, are at least within possibilities of getting done.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I would add to that because you actually did hit on that does hit on some of the things that I was thinking about too. And my thing that was sort of on my list was citizen only voting districts. So the reason that I think that matters is because if you look at how voting districts are built up, especially for I think for federal elections, is that you take a census. The census
Yeah.
counts every single person in an area, and then each section of I can't remember how many people it is, but like 250,000 people or something
Right.
becomes a district.
Right.
So right now, since you count every single person, everybody in the country, regardless of how they got there, counts as part of that voting district. And one of the big things that's going to be important in this election is going to be immigration. So you look at, I don't know what the stats are about the 4 years that Biden has been in office, but it's
Right.
the number of people that have crossed the border illegally is like 20 million or something.
Yeah. It's definitely been pretty
It's
crazy.
huge.
Yeah.
And so if you pump 20 million people into a place, you're going to create a lot of extra voting districts because you have to account for that 20 million people. And so that's one of the things that incentivizes, I think, the Democrats to allow so much illegal immigration because it like you hear about the exodus from California. Companies are leaving California, people are leaving California, but the population of California doesn't seem to really be going down much. Well, why is that? It's because we're also importing enormous numbers of people, and it props up all these districts in California, which means California has a greater representation in Congress than it probably should. It has a greater representation, in a lot of ways for a lot of things, a lot more power than it probably should have. And so what we do is we use this influx of people as a way in partial to gerrymander districts because, you just
Hmm.
shuffle the people around who have no rights because they're in the country illegally, so you can exploit them in any way that you want, which is just completely immoral. And then,
Yep.
the state of California uses that excess population to keep itself in power. And it's just completely wrong. Because theoretically, at least legally, none of the people who've crossed in the country illegally can vote. So why are they part of a
Right.
being counted as part of a voting district? So part of the
Right.
getting rid of the gerrymandering is getting rid of this, excuse to bring in innumerable people into a population to prop up your population power, which props up your districting capacity. So I
Yep.
think because immigration is a huge issue, gerrymandering to me is a huge issue. One of the things that you have to look at and say is, look, from now on, instead of just being the population of a place, it's the population of registered voters. And then
Right.
that makes up the districts, the people who are actually voting, not just the people who happen to be there at any particular moment when you do the census.
Right. Well, and again, that helps apply the incentive in the right direction because
Right,
we need immigrants of all stripes, right? But we need
right,
to do it in a logical way and get them on the path to becoming citizens.
right,
And the ultimate badge of being a citizen is being able to vote, right?
right.
So that would again incent, regardless of what your position is on, the whole illegal immigration thing and on that, or undocumented, depending on how politically correct you want to be, um, is that the goal shouldn't be about just attracting people to an area and growing that
Mhm.
population. It should be attracting people who are going to be citizens ultimately.
Right.
And that's what we want.
And the thing is, too, it's like going back to the public and private, discriminating between public unions and private unions. It's so important to discriminate between legal immigration and illegal immigration. If
Right.
you think that we want to bring in 20 million people every year, then have a law that says every year we will accept 20 million people into the country from wherever.
Right.
I mean, I'm
Most countries
I'm
do that.
100% for legal immigration. Almost everybody
Yeah.
has relatives who immigrated to this country at some point. The life's blood of the country in many respects is immigration. And I've said
Right.
for forever, one of the greatest strengths of the United States is that we steal the brain power from the rest of the world. Anybody
Right.
who's smart and innovative and entrepreneurial and wants to have some place to concede for the history of this country, they've come here. And that has
Hmm.
benefited everybody so immeasurably, it's just incalculable. So of
Right.
course we want immigration, but the idea that what you do that you're going to prefer illegal immigration to legal immigration, which is what the Democrats are doing right now. We don't have 20 million legal immigrants coming into the country every year. The reason the Democrats want to import people into the country illegally is because it helps them with districting, and then it helps them have this black market labor economy so that places like California can survive with the ridiculous, minimum wage laws. I mean, the hypocrisy of the minimum wage law, it's mind boggling. It's like, okay, we're going to pay everybody $20 an hour, except, of course, the people here who are here illegally have no rights. And so we'll
Yeah.
just pay them under the table with cash, and we'll create this essentially indentured servitude class that serves to prop up the economy of California.
Well, yeah.
That is so abysmally wrong. I can't even describe it.
Right. And again, it's one of those things that it comes back to the incentives, and we can fix immigration when the whole immigration system, but we keep fighting over the basically putting roadblocks on both sides
Yeah.
for whatever reason because it's a campaign tactic.
Yeah.
They become pawns in all this, and
Yep.
I feel for some of the, I mean, you read about like what's going on in Venezuela right now with their election process
Oh,
and
I know.
Maduro, the dictatorship. So I totally understand why people are trying to get out of there, right?
Yeah. No,
And we
yeah,
need
I agree.
we need to understand, but again, we're not going to fix Venezuela's problem for them.
Right.
There's some other things we need to do to hopefully from a global stance get together and help Venezuela try
Right.
and figure this out. But taking in anybody and everybody that's in fear of their life, it's not gonna make any difference in
And the
the
thing is,
case
if
of
you wanted to
Venezuela.
take in everybody and anybody who was in fear of their life, and you wrote laws to say, hey, this is the policy of the United States, the
Right.
majority of people voted
It's
for
true.
this to be the case, and this is what we're going to do. Okay, that's fine. But that's not what they're doing. And that's my whole
No.
point about creating the black market economy.
Oh yeah.
My feeling is that at this point, the politicians, especially California being, one of the prime movers, want the illegal low cost labor. They want people in the country that don't have rights. They can say, "Hey, I need to be getting paid this amount. I'm going to go to court. I'm going to sue you for doing things." They want this black market underground labor. So they literally want people coming into the country illegally so that they can be exploited to prop up the economy of the major cities. It's
Yep.
evil. It's absolutely
Yep.
evil.
Yep. No, no, absolutely. And again, it's one of these things you got to try and figure out where the incentives are. Hate to beat
Yeah.
a dead horse, but it comes down to how we're handling these campaigns and, the whole gerrymandering thing. And to your point, really focusing on those districts about who is actually voting in that district, not the
Right.
population of that district. And you take care of those two things, and a lot of this stuff people will start coming together to come up with some practical solutions on the border.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to happen otherwise.
Yeah.
I
And
guarantee you, if they don't do something like this, in 5 years, we're going to have the same conversation,
oh yeah.
just like we've
No,
had for
no
the last
question.
25 years.
Yeah. And I see that we're getting close to our 30-minute
Yeah.
time, but I wanted to sort of interject something to sort of wrap it up a little bit because the number one issue to people in this next election is the economy. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to interject an idea about what the economy actually is. Everybody talks about the economy, but what is the economy exactly? And there's lots of different definitions for it, and there's lots of brilliant economists out there. I'm not one of them, but I have a definition for economy that I think kind of helps people understand the situation, which is The economy of any place, of any group, is the sum total of all human interactions within that population. And so when you start thinking about the fact that literally everything that everybody does has some effect on the economy, you start to think, okay, wait a minute. So we've talked about voting, immigration, healthcare, um, how you fund campaigns. All of those things contribute to what could be a good economy or a bad economy. And right now, what we do is we make too many bad decisions that end up damaging our economy, which is why we're having economic woes at the moment. But you can't think of the economy just as like one thing, the economy. The economy is actually everything. And as soon as you start to realize that, you're like, okay, I can't have 25 bad decisions and then maybe one good one and think that things are going to work out economically for anybody. Oh, I think I lost you.
We're there. There we go. Sorry, I had it on mute. Some house cleaning started behind me, and so it was like I figured you didn't want to listen to the vacuum. Uh, it's Saturday. What can I say?
Yes, it's the way it is.
Um, so no, I totally agree, and that's always the funny part on the again going back to news media and stuff, talking about they all so much of the economy news is Wall Street. It's like
That's just such a
this
tiny
is
part
such
of
a
it.
small part
Yeah,
overall of what's going on. It's like, but the society's been trained to think that way,
yeah,
and it's like, no, it's so much more involved in that.
yeah.
And I don't know the best way to measure it because I know everybody wants to be able to measure it in some shape or form, but there isn't really a clean definition. The closest thing I've ever heard was I'm trying to remember what country it is. It might be, is it Thailand? It's either Thailand or one of the Scandinavian countries. They have the happiness score,
Oh,
how
yeah,
happy how happy people are.
yeah. I
And
think that's a good one,
ultimately
actually.
that's what it comes down to, right? In my
Yeah,
mind, if the economy's good or it's working well for people or the government's good, working well for people, people their happiness score goes up and down. It's like,
yeah.
if you're going to have a score, that's probably the best one because it
I,
sort of consolidates everything.
I actually think that one measure of economy that's kind of a really good one is actually life expectancy. The life expectancy of a population is going to be better in places that are thriving than in places that are not thriving. And then when you see the life expectancy go up, you figure, okay, things maybe are getting a little bit better. If you see the life expectancy go down, things are probably getting a little bit worse. And one of the things that, has happened recently but had never happened before is life expectancy in the United States went down. And I think that's a very telling thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No. So, well, we'll wrap it up there. We've got some great stuff to kind of dive deeper in. I didn't see us going off into the immigration thing quite this point, but that's good because it
It
really,
is an important
it,
issue.
well, and it is one of those issues that encapsulates so many of these other things we've talked about in terms of focusing on campaign finance and all that stuff. So, we'll keep digging down into this because I think this, at least for me, helps define how can a third party really make a name for itself.
Yeah, I think it's important. Really, really
Yeah.
important.
All right. Well, we'll catch up with you next week.
Yep, sounds good.